This is part 2 of the tissue chapter in anatomy and physiology, and we left off with we had just started talking about how we classify epithelial tissue. So we are now on slide 22. The first thing that we look at is the number of cell layers. If there is only one layer of cells, then we call that simple epithelium, a single layer of cells. And if there are many layers or multiple layers of cells, even if it's only 2 layers of cells, we call that stratified epithelium. Then we classify further by cell shape. The squamous epithelium is thin and flat from the side, and looking at it from the top, the cells almost look like fried eggs because they have that fried egg appearance because they have the nucleus is in here, looks like the egg yolk. And then the cuboidal epithelium looks cubic, and the columnar epithelium are rectangle, but they are tall. They are columnar shaped. They're the tallest of the epithelial cells. So now we look at their cell layer and their cell type together, and that is how we classify epithelial tissue. Simple squamous epithelial tissue. In fact, I'm just going to show you the pictures. There we go. All right, so you can see how looking from the top that the squamous cells have that fried egg appearance. But looking at them from the side, they are very, very thin. Simple squamous epithelial tissue is the thinnest type of epithelial tissue. So it is mainly for absorption and secretion. Let's see. Well, the main example that I know of, there are two, is the blood capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels, are made of simple squamous epithelial tissue, and then the alveoli, or the air sacs of the lungs, are made of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And we move on to simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, and the kidney tubules, called nephrons, are composed of simple cuboidal epithelium. And the simple columnar epithelium is found, usually its apical surface is covered in microvilli, as you can see here. And when you look under the microscope, the nuclei kind of are all lined up in a row, parallel, form a single line when you look at the tissue. So a lot of times this tissue functions in absorption, lines the stomach and the intestines. Okay. And then again, so you can see the tissue while I talk about it. The stratified squamous epithelium is what you find forming the epidermis of the skin. And then it also lines openings of the body that open to the exterior. So the mouth, the anus, the vagina, the ears, the nose, all the throat, the esophagus, all of those that open up to the exterior of the body are lined also with stratified squamous epithelial tissue. But on the skin, the tissue is dry, whereas it's moist, in the openings that we talked about. All right, now this is another one that's kind of different. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And you find this, it's called pseudostratified, first of all, because It's really only a single layer of cells, but the cells are all such different shapes that you can't really tell that. Um, every cell in this tissue touches the basement membrane. But since they're all different shapes and sizes, the nuclei are scattered, and when you look at this tissue under the microscope, it looks like stratified tissue. But it's not. It's only a single layer of cells. So we call it pseudostratified because it looks stratified and it's not. And it is typically covered with cilia, and the cells some of the cells are columnar, so we just call the entire tissue columnar. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. And you find this lining the nasal cavity, the trachea, the bronchi, and also the male reproductive tract, where the cilia move the sperm along before they're able to swim on their own. Transitional epithelium looks, it appears to be cuboidal or columnar when the tissue is unstretched. In other words, an empty bladder. The cells look a lot taller, but then whenever the tissue stretches, the cells look a lot thinner and flatter, so they may look more squamous or cuboidal. So any tissue that does a lot of stretching will contain transitional epithelium. A pseudostratified columnar, we just talked about that, and transitional. Okay, so now we're moving on to glandular epithelial tissue. Okay, the exocrine glands, remember, discharge their secretion through a duct, which is a short tube, and then the duct empties onto an external or internal surface. The duct system can be branching, and the exocrine glands are classified based on how the secretion is released from the cells. Endocrine glands release hormones directly into the blood, and they do not have ducts. Now, for exocrine glands, they can be divided or classified into three different types: merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. A merocrine secretion is when the secretion is released by exocytosis and no damage is done to the cell that releases the secretion. An example of a merocrine secretion is salivary glands. Mucin mixes with water to produce mucus. That is a secretion that is a merocrine secretion. Apocrine secretion is when the secretion is released along with maybe the top half of the cell. So some of the cytoplasm of the cell is shed along with the secretion. And then that cell will grow and repair before it can release any more secretion. Mammary glands release an apocrine secretion. Sweat glands. There are some sweat glands that release merocrine sweat, which is watery, and then other sweat glands like under our armpits and in the groin area release an odorous, thicker, sweaty secretion, and that is an apocrine sweat. Holocrine secretion is like your oil glands, your sebaceous glands. When that secretion is released, the entire cell that contains the oil is burst. So it kills the actual cells that release the secretion. That's a holocrine secretion. I know it's not spelled like the word whole, but I just always remember the whole cell is destroyed in a holocrine secretion. Now, types of secretions can be watery. Serous glands secrete watery secretions along with enzymes. Mucus glands secrete mucins that form mucus, and mixed glands secrete a serous and mucus secretion. And by the way, this is an English lesson, but if it's a noun, mucus is spelled M-U-C-U-S. So the actual substance mucus has just C-U-S at the end. But if it is an adjective, like when we're saying mucus secretions, we're describing the secretion as a mucus secretion. Then you use OUS. So that's not a spelling error when you see that. Okay, this table helps to explain the classification of exocrine glands. Merocrine, an example of merocrine is saliva from salivary glands, mucus in the digestive and respiratory tracts, perspiration on the skin, but it's merocrine perspiration, merocrine sweat, which is watery. Make sure you know that, the watery perspiration, not the perspiration that smells, that has a bad odor. And in merocrine secretions, the cell is not damaged in any way. In apocrine secretions, the cytoplasm is shed, some of the cytoplasm of the cell is shed along with the secretion. There are, just like with sweat, there is merocrine milk and there is apocrine milk. And the viscous underarm perspiration, the thicker odorous sweat, the sweat that has an odor, is an apocrine secretion. And holocrine secretions, for example, are the oils that are secreted from the sebaceous glands of the skin. That is when the entire cell is destroyed along with the secretion. Serous secretions are watery, mucus secretions are thick, and mixed are a mix of both. Okay, number 10 and 11. 10. The secretory cells of sebaceous glands fill with secretions and then rupture, releasing their contents. Which mode of secretion occurs in sebaceous glands? And of course, we learned that that is holocrine. Those sebaceous glands are releasing sebum or oil, holocrine. Which type of gland releases its secretions directly into the extracellular fluid and then into the blood? And that's going to be exocrine. I'm sorry, gosh. Endocrine. The exocrine release their secretions through a duct onto a surface. So we have covered epithelial tissue. We're going to move on to connective tissue, and we're going to spend the most time on connective tissue, and we will mention muscle and nervous tissue, but we will not spend a great deal of time on the last two tissue types. Connective tissue is the most diverse of all the four tissue types. There are three basic components. Instead of just being cells that are packed tightly together, you have specialized cells surrounded by protein fibers like collagen and some type of a ground substance, which can be very fluid or it can be more of a solid. The matrix is the combination of the extracellular protein fibers and the ground substance. So in other words, it is the material that surrounds the specialized cells. We call that the matrix. Many connective tissues are highly vascular, but not all. One type of connective tissue is cartilage, and cartilage does not have a very much of a blood supply. Connective tissues contain sensory receptors. These are the functions: support and protection, transportation of materials, storage of energy reserves, and defense of the body. And here we see three major types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper consists of loose and dense connective tissue. Fluid connective tissue is either blood or lymph, and supporting connective tissue is cartilage and bone. Connective tissue proper has a syrupy ground substance, and it contains almost it can contain all three of the um, extracellular fibers.